it water with the sheep in the box?
If there's one fundamental disagreement at the heart of mainstream politics, it's this. Should it be the responsibility of the system or the individual to ensure the well-being of the majority or the people? Often this is framed in a big versus small government kind of way, but at the end of the day it comes down to a fundamental disconnect between the sanctity of the individual and the failure of the systems under which we live. The difference between the left and the rest of the political spectrum is that we acknowledge that it is impossible to have meaningful individual choices when our lives are almost entirely dictated by unfair, unbalanced and rigged systems, as I'll now explain. This video will be split into two main sections discussing the two main concepts integral to this discussion, namely the systemic versus individual dichotomy and the myth of personal responsibility. Let's get to it, shall we?
You have to take personal responsibility for your lives. The way your communities is today is because you don't want to pick up the shovel. You don't want to pick up the bucket. You don't want to do any of that stuff. And it's always white people's fault. There's always someone else's fault. No, it's not. It's your fault. You did to your life.
One of the most important principles of personal development is this idea that you have to take 100% responsibility for your life. If you're confused about what responsibility means, and if you don't actually take 100% responsibility for your life, then it's going to be very difficult for you to make any kind of progress in your personal development. You're basically going to become stuck permanently. You're going to become a victim and you're going to stay a victim. And this is how people kill their personal development forever. For some people, they cannot progress at all anymore because they have just entrenched themselves in victim thinking.
The primary difference, in my opinion, between those who support capitalism and those who oppose it is really quite simple: critiquing systems or critiquing individual people. As leftists, we talk about systemic issues all the time, with good reason in my opinion, and that's because fundamentally we believe that it's systems of oppression that are to blame for many, if not all, of society's ills, and that if we fix or tear down those oppressive systems, we can, if not fix all those problems, then at the very least help to reduce the harm they cause. Liberals and conservatives, on the other hand, will ignore this most of the time and instead point to individuals and say that actually the problem with the police, let's say, is a few bad apples, or that the reason crime is so high in black neighbourhoods is not due to the obvious and provable link between poverty and crime, but because black people just so happen to make bad choices. The liberal version of this is usually something along the lines of all Trump voters are universally, individually racist, sexist monsters who should be rounded up and shot rather than victims of circumstance and a prolonged propaganda campaign. Or promoting some kind of IQ test before one is eligible to vote, assuming of course that every right-winger is just a moron. You know, the movie Bob approach.
The individual has intrinsic value in Western societies. Do you know how long it took people to formulate that as an idea? And how unlikely that idea is that poor you, useless, powerless you, with all your damn faults, you're actually worth something. You're worth something to the point that the law has to respect you. God, we don't want to abandon that for some half-witted collectivism, which we're doing as rapidly as possible.
So then, if the problem is the system, why does the left constantly say all cops are bastards? Seems a little hypocritical, right? Well, that's kind of true, but most of us on the left do acknowledge that the problem is the practice of policing, not bad police officers, but we would also go on to argue that participating in the practice arguably makes you complicit in it, regardless of anything else you do. So, for example, if you were a slave trader, regardless of any good you did to try and balance your good deeds out, you would still be a monster, because morality isn't a numbers game where if you do enough good things to balance out the bad, you're suddenly a good person. It's not like Edward Colston was an okay guy because he balanced out his participation in the slave trade with charity and philanthropy. Like, the slavery thing was minus 50 good boy points, but he gave a bunch of money to charity, so that gave him plus 75. So he was actually a good person because he died with plus 25 good boy points.
Edward Colston was a 17th century merchant, politician, and philanthropist. He built schools, hospitals, and poorhouses in the city of Bristol, West England, with wealth generated from money lending, investments in wine, sherry, cloth, and as deputy governor of the Royal African Company, which, in addition to trading gold, silver, and ivory, trafficked slaves and the products of slave labour, such as sugar, to the British colonies in the Caribbean.
No, he was a monster for participating in the slave trade at all, and everything else he did is irrelevant to that point. Bad people can do good things from time to time. This is not a new concept for us, but that doesn't undo the harm they cause. Let's take the most extreme example of this to make the point. Nazi concentration camp guards were all monsters regardless of their actual positions within the camps or anything else they did in their life at the time. I think we can agree. Like, no amount of charity work or helping old people cross the street can ever balance that out, positive though those actions may be. Now, what does this say about morality? Well, if the system is immoral and you willingly participate in it and allow it to continue, are you not immoral? If you sign paperwork, collect gold, push pencils regarding the extermination of millions of people without question, are you not a monster? How far do we accept the just following orders excuse? Is there a limit? But okay, you may point out that's unfair, most of those people have no choice. If they refused to follow orders, they would have been shot. Alright then, let's assume that that's true. Does it then follow that people who do choose their assignments and have the option to quit at any time are liable for their part in perpetuating and supporting a harmful system? You see, rampant brutality and disgusting behaviour taking place in your daily life and you not only doing little, if anything, to stop it, but actively choosing to work within that system or organisation, well, what does that say about you? And here's where we bring it back to people like cops and landlords. When we say all cops are bastards or whatever, we don't mean every police officer is a monster on a personal level, we mean the police as an institution is flawed and monstrous and is only getting worse, so to work within it and carry out its orders makes you, if not a bad person, then at least someone who perpetuates an incredible amount of harm and statistically probably abuse your spouse. Sure, there's a lot of to and fro about the role of good cops to be had, but I don't know if that's really all that convincing considering that the problems have not got better or in any way been alleviated by these so-called good cops that apparently make up the majority. The machine is broken and one or two minor cogs aren't going to do much to make a change, now are they? Likewise, when we on the left talk about landlords, we don't mean that all landlords are despicable slumlords. In fact, most of us have probably had some pretty good landlords at one point or another, but the fact that they participate in and benefit from a system of exploitation and coercion makes them a bad person. Both cops or landlords could quit at any time if they really wanted and get a proper job. If they disagreed with the way the system worked or were morally outraged enough, mass resignations would send a much more powerful message than occasionally politely asking your co-workers not to beat unarmed black men to death, but nobody seems to really be calling on police officers to protest that way, because that would mean acknowledging that the problem is the system, and generally we in the West like to pretend that the problem in all cases is individual bad people, or to use a particular buzz phrase, individualize systemic problems in order to avoid having to deal with them. After all, it's just a couple of bad apples, you just have to get rid of a few individuals. But if it's the whole system, then that's a much more difficult problem to solve, and if your entire worldview revolves around insisting that there is no problem with the system, it can be quite hard to accept. However, I do think it's important to acknowledge that this makes sense for systems that require active participation and support, but not necessarily systems of privilege based on immutable characteristics. Let's briefly talk about that, shall we?
The individual has intrinsic value in Western societies. Do you know how long it took people to formulate that as an idea? And how unlikely that idea is that poor you, useless, powerless you, with all your damn faults, you're actually worth something. You're worth something to the point that the law has to respect you. God, we don't want to abandon that for some half-witted collectivism, which we're doing as rapidly as possible.
I hate to say it, but a minority of people, mostly liberals because, well, of fucking course, do that thing that the anti-SJWs used to fearmonger about in 2016 and simply assume that people with various kinds of privileges have an easy lot in life, or that having one kind of privilege means that you're incapable of being anything other than rich and successful. Just look at the brainworms on display in these tweets, for example. I guess I'm going to have to explain the importance of intersectionality again. Privilege is important to discuss and to acknowledge the effects of, but life isn't made up of binaries like black equals poor, white equals rich, or whatever, and all the various privileges, or lack thereof, intersect and interact with one another. For example, a black trans woman may receive a horrendous amount of prejudice or violence because of both their race and their gender identity intersecting and causing oppression on two fronts. A white gay man, by contrast, may receive abuse and harassment based on their sexuality and be held back and discriminated against at work, for example, and and the fact that that person is white doesn't make a huge difference there, because focusing on one lens of oppression whilst ignoring the others is absurd, even if we take identity out of this. The fact of the matter is that any one of us could be like 1 or 2 pieces of bad luck away from being homeless and destitute, and whilst, yes, being a white cishet dude may cause one to be insulated from some of the worst of identity-based oppression, and obviously such a person wouldn't have to deal with much racism or homophobia, but being white or cis or whatever doesn't make you immune to the daily struggle under capitalism that we're forced to endure every day, and doesn't make you any less exploited and downtrodden by those in power. Individual white people or cis people or straight people aren't to blame for racism, transphobia or homophobia. It's the system under which we live that's to blame for these things, and whilst, yes, it is incredibly important to understand and accept the injustices and privileges people have and endure in our society, it's just also important to recognise that this oppression Olympics bullshit is unhelpful and counterproductive. The problems with the race gap when it comes to income, for example, are not due to white people keeping black people down, but due to institutionally racist systems causing and exacerbating these problems. And simplifying the problem down to it's white people's fault is not helpful. Sure, white people as a whole can and should acknowledge and oppose these systems, but it's the systems that need to be opposed, not the individual people. Think of it in terms of the reparations discussion that occasionally gets brought up, which the right live in fear of. It's not individual modern white people that should pay black people out of their paychecks as an apology for slavery, as it's often framed. It's actually a recompense and rectification of the decades of oppression and devastation of black people's lives and well-being. It's not just giving individual black people a lump sum of cash, it's about spending the money that was stolen to even the playing field out and to undo some of the damage and systemic oppression caused by centuries of racial prejudice and, yes, oppression. Don't be like these fucking people who think that white people cannot suffer because they're white. That's just fucking unhinged and a flagrant misunderstanding of privilege. Don't blame individual people, blame systems and, yes, those who contribute to and choose to perpetuate them.
This idea that there are these inescapable chains of poverty, that no decision you make can help you escape these things, you know, if that's true, then we're not doing a good enough job on a private level. And so our goal as individuals, not as a society, because I don't like to talk about our goals as a quote-unquote society. Our goals as individuals should be to help people make the right decisions so they can escape these bad decisions that they were about to make. And people's goals as individuals should also be not to make the bad decisions.
Well, I personally feel that when we are more personally responsible for our own lives, life blooms. You know, a magic enters our life, not just the magic of confidence and certainty in who we are, but a sense of total truth with what life is supposed to be for ourselves. You know, we are not meant to be victims or apathetic people laying around hoping that something comes along and changes our lives.
In my 3 decades as a professor and clinical psychologist, I've learned that there are 2 fundamental attitudes toward life and its sorrows. Those with the first attitude blame the world. Those with the second ask what they could do differently. Other people aren't the problem. You're the problem.
This is the favourite argument of people who have no empathy and want to shift blame from problematic or harmful systems or institutions to the individuals suffering from or complaining about them. Victim blaming, basically. It's the ANCAP go-to argument, but run-of-the-mill conservatives and even liberals like to use it too. You've probably heard it a million times before. Oh, you say that black people make up a disproportionate amount of the prison population and are heavily discriminated against in the courts, but have you considered that maybe they should just take responsibility for their life instead of returning to a life of crime? Or alternatively, you can't complain about being poor and just blame it on the system that actively requires an underclass in order to function. Take responsibility for your own life. Stop blaming others for your misfortune. Sure, if you're able to, do everything you can to succeed, obviously, but let's not pretend that everyone is in complete control of their own destiny, or that there aren't significant roadblocks to success for a lot of marginalized people. Personal responsibility is a nice idea, but in reality, in order for it to make any sense, everyone would have to have completely equal opportunities in life and start from the exact same position, which I'm sorry to say simply isn't the case right now.
Other people aren't the problem. You're the problem.
This one really pisses me off. Conservatives want to be able to point to victims of an unjust system and claim that they're not being responsible enough and blaming black people for their own systemic oppression in the legal system because of committing more crime or being lazy or whatever, and we'll get to the absolute fucking shit show that was conservatives trying to rationalise literally stealing food from out of the mouths of children later, but the fact remains that a core tenet of conservative beliefs is this illogical, cruel and just ignorant idea that there is no such thing as systemic issues. It's just a coincidence that black people all seem to be at higher risk of being victimised and abused by the police and legal system, right? Well, see, this is the point where it gets a little awkward and also becomes rather clear as to why this rhetoric is so popular in the first place. See, if the right were to acknowledge and accept the existence of a systemic problem or issue that may need resolving, then that leaves them in the unfortunate position of having to explain why they enacted these policies in the first place. After all, it was the right to oppose the abolition of slavery, imposed segregation, and started the drug war, aided and abetted by their most loyal allies, the centrists and liberals, meaning that in order to admit that there is a systemic race problem within the legal system, one necessarily needs to also condemn in the strongest possible terms conservative heroes like Ronald Reagan, or liberal heroes like Joe Biden, who may as well be conservative, to be honest. Likewise, if we really examine the queerphobia rampant throughout the UK, we have to look to Margaret Thatcher and maybe even modern politicians like Theresa May, former Prime Minister, who had some interesting opinions about lesbians in the 80s. Likewise, with all the people going on about personal responsibility regarding the aforementioned refusal of the Tory party to continue the free school meal for kids living in poverty, well, this is a desperate attempt to shift the blame. As everyone who keeps up with this kind of thing knows, child poverty is up and we know why. There are definitive, provable answers here and they all point in one direction: austerity, and the last decade of slashing child benefits and services to help those in need has caused massive, widespread child poverty, up 600,000 in comparison to 2011 and 2012, although this figure only covers up until March 2019, aka before the pandemic and a huge spike in employment figures, so suffice to say that the actual number is likely significantly higher than that. This is provable. We have data showing that the disgusting treatment of those in the most need has caused child poverty to skyrocket, and now we're expected to just believe that, yeah, that's irrelevant. The parents just don't want to take responsibility, and so on and so forth.
And can I ask you something else that a lot of people are talking about this morning? It's MPs rejecting Marcus Rashford's free school meals drive. He'd been pushing for it to be extended into holidays to be able to support those children who are finding it particularly difficult at the moment because of poverty to get the food that they need. What did you make of this? Was it something that you backed?
I voted with the government on this one. I think it's incredibly difficult because everyone has enormous sympathy with what Marcus Rashford is arguing for. I think we have to wait and see where we're at over the Christmas holidays. If we're in a lockdown situation, if families on the breadline need extra help, I think MPs and the Chancellor would be very sympathetic. But we're not quite at that point yet.
It's difficult, isn't it, though? I mean, Marcus Rashford spoke about it and he said, you know, a significant number of children are going to bed tonight not only hungry, but feeling like they don't matter because of comments that have been made today. And for them, I guess it's hard to feel that they've been ignored by politicians.
I want to have a discussion with you. You said, can I invite you, you invited Marcus Rashford, can I invite you to one of the country's most deprived schools to come discuss with the head, who agrees with me, in brackets. And a governor at that school has responded to your tweet saying, unfortunately for you, I'm a governor at that very school. And I've just spoken to the head, and I can assure you that our view is very much that the kids need free school meal vouchers. I ask you to correct this and not give false impressions of a school which fights tooth and nail for their kids.
I have no wish to draw any of my local schools into an argument. Indeed, my
well, you
point...
did, didn't you, by inviting Marcus Rashford to come to a school?
Inadvertently, and I would like Marcus to come to school. That invitation remains open. I have no wish to fall out with Marcus. The point I'm simply making is that I think that the state can add to what's happening within our communities, that broad community support to help vulnerable people.
I think actually our policy on this is, I know this is a very emotive issue, it's a sensitive issue, and it's something that affects families in my constituency as well as around the country. I think the position we have taken is the right position, because what we're looking to do is ensure we deal with child poverty at the core and put the structure in place that means even in school holidays, children can get access to the food that they need.
Enjoyed the flattery in the answer, but sadly it's not going to make me move off the topic that quickly. I'm genuinely trying to work out why the government is opposing this. Is it because it's too expensive, or is it because you don't agree with the principle of it?
But a few hours ago, I mean, you responded to a tweet saying that £20 cash direct going to Crackden and brothel really sounds like the way forward with that's what free school meal vouchers in the summer effectively did. Now, you did delete that tweet, but what were you even getting at with that comment?
It's taken totally out of context. What I was trying to say is that a tiny, tiny minority of families in some of the worst situations are not helped by giving them vouchers and cash. What we really need to do is, as local authorities, as social services, as schools, to find those children who really are in the most dire need, and to put in more holistic, direct, long-term support to help them.
You can't deliberately rig the system against those in need, legislate specifically to harm them, and restrict their autonomy or ability to plan for an emergency by relaxing employment regulations, allowing 0-hour contracts and the median wage to fall pretty dramatically, and then turn around and say that those people you fucked over should have just taken responsibility. That would be a shitty and needlessly cruel thing to say under the best of circumstances, but when you were the one who took their ability to effectively improve their situation in the first place and forced them to rely on services like free school meals in order to afford to feed their kids, well, not only are you kind of a dick, but you're also talking out your arse there. Blaming people for not taking responsibility when it comes to their situations can only work and only makes sense if everyone starts from an even position, and if there are support networks or services to help them do so. Otherwise, it's just obvious bullshit, and no amount of "but dry pasta and shit tomato sauce is cheap" can change that. Either provide those services, make it possible for people to get by without assistance, and then maybe we can talk about personal responsibility, because until then, you're basically just pointing at a sailor you marooned on a desert island after cutting his arms and legs off, take responsibility for his actions, and make his own way back to civilization, when, like, at that point you're just taking the piss, right? Actually, that's a point. Has anyone checked if any of this shit is just some cruel satire?
Other people aren't the problem. You're the problem.
"You made your choice" is a phrase that often gets thrown in the faces of people daring to question or complain about the predicament they find themselves in. Usually single mothers who, it's implied, shouldn't have had kids, often by pro-life people, because why not just abandon our principles in order to bash the poor? A lot of the time, people's misfortune is not their own fault or due to unforeseen circumstances, and we could just end this point here, but it's my position that not only should this distinction not matter, but that those of us in the greatest need never had much of a choice to begin with. See, free will is a universally revered and universally misunderstood concept. We all like to think that we're the masters of our own destiny, that we at least have capacity for freedom of choice in this fucked up world, but we don't, at least in the ways that matter. Not really. Allow me to explain. How can one have freedom of choice if many, if not most, choices are unavailable to us? How can one be free whilst being constrained by the society and culture under which we live? You have no choice but to either work or starve a lot of the time, and as a result you're forced to sell your labour and follow extremely strict rules and exist under a very strict hierarchy. Failure to do so will result in harsh punishment or even dismissal, which again, for a lot of people is basically the same thing as being kicked out into the street. Your only options when it comes to housing are renting from a private landlord or wait for a decade to be put on a waiting list for council housing. In either case, you have no choice but to adhere to the strict rules enforced upon you by your landlord or the council, or you will be literally thrown out into the street. No pets is a standard one, no parties, no redecorating or making the house feel like your own, because that might affect the house value going forward. Most of the time you'll have to take any old shit, because it's not like most people can afford to be picky anyway. Sure, you can try and buy your own home, but good luck with that, with the housing market being what it is as wages stagnate. So just with those two aspects of capitalism, we've eliminated work, where you spend most of your time, and home, where you spend the rest of it, as places where realistically free will doesn't happen. You have to ask permission to get a pet to help alleviate the existential existential dread and crushing loneliness that comes as part and parcel of life under capitalism, and speaking just from my own experience, I have never been granted permission to have a pet by my landlord, despite the fact that I live alone at the moment and it can really get quite lonely, especially during lockdown, and depending on the job you can get in serious trouble for a number of reasons. My personal favourite was the time I got called into a disciplinary meeting for taking too long having a shit at work. So what choices do you have? You can't choose how you spend a majority of your time, what you expend most of your effort on, and how you live or arrange your own space at home, and unless you're rich you don't even really get to choose stuff like what holidays to go on or what car to drive, because all those things are constrained by budgets. Sure, you get to pick from a few options, but is that really free will if there's a limited set of options in the first place? Of course, this isn't unique to class. We could equally say that before the normalization and recognition of non-binary gender identities in the West, non-binary people didn't really have much of a choice when it came to expressing or just existing the way that they felt comfortable. Not only because doing so would have resulted in alienation or abuse at the hands of a society that simply wouldn't have understood, but also because until very recently, people just weren't made aware that being non-binary was even an option, and as a result, when working themselves out, a non-binary person may not necessarily have realised who they were because that option wasn't ever presented as a thing that even existed. It's for this reason that arguing for personal responsibility and blaming societal problems on bad choices is a load of shit, because honestly, we don't have a full range of choices to begin with, so it's not like an informed decision was being made in desperate situations like those faced by the poorest in society. But even if it was, why would that be a reason to demonize and attack people? Sure, people can make the wrong decision out of the limited options they were given, but why should that dictate the rest of a person's life, even if we accept that it was a free and informed decision?
Other people aren't the problem. You're the problem.
Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, that every poor person is poor because of their own bad choices, that they had kids they couldn't afford because they weren't careful enough and they fell in with a bad crowd, maybe committed a few crimes in their late teens or early adulthood. The question I'd like answered is this: why is it acceptable for a couple of mistakes to determine the rest of a person's life? Why should we deem it acceptable to condemn a person to a lifetime of poverty because they were a dumb kid who made some bad choices? Shouldn't we instead try to help them rebuild their life and to ensure that a couple of bad choices doesn't determine an entire life? Because right now, our society is almost entirely focused on maintaining systems that prevent upward mobility, whilst the people within those systems are taught to believe that it's the individual's fault. Let's discuss a couple of examples to demonstrate what I mean.
Not having babies out of wedlock is definitely not influenced by factors beyond your control. I mean, unless you have uncontrollable genitalia.
This is the most commonly cited example of this. The idea, of course, is that you chose to become pregnant despite being aware that you were in no position to raise a child, so now it's down to you to take responsibility for that decision and the consequences of daring to have sex whilst poor and or a woman. Now, there are many angles I could come at this from, like, for example, pointing out that a lot of the time pregnancy is not due to a conscious decision, either due to sexual assault or simple contraceptive failure, which is rare but of course does happen, or indeed being in a position to raise a child only to have your circumstances change. The response to this is usually something along the lines of, don't have sex at all then, but well, that's just bullshit, isn't it? Sex is a basic human need and hormones are powerful things. And when you say don't have sex if you can't afford a child, basically what you're saying is only the rich get to fuck. Besides, studies have shown that promoting abstinence only increases teen pregnancy, not decreases it, so it wouldn't even work. But okay, let's for the moment grant that it's somehow the fault of the mother that they got pregnant, or a choice that they consciously made. They have the kid, and now all they have to do is take responsibility and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they'll be fine, right? I mean, it's just irresponsible parents who have to suffer as a result of the miracle of childbirth, not the nice, responsible Christian girls who made a mistake and chose to make the best of the situation, right? Well, not so much. You see, when you're a single parent, you basically have two options. Raise your child yourself whilst relying on handouts and government benefits, or work yourself to the bone whilst not getting to be as involved a parent. Now, the obvious responsible thing to do would be to go into work, right? That way you can start taking responsibility and drag yourself out of poverty by earning your own money. Or rather, that would be the case if there was free, guaranteed 24-hour, high-quality childcare and modern wages were sufficient to support an adult and a child, which isn't the case. See, if you, as a young single parent, decide to go into work either in the years before your kid goes to school or outside of school hours, which is literally all full-time jobs, but especially stuff like night or weekend shifts and gig work, then you will will need to use at least some degree of childcare unless you have family willing to help out in that respect, which most people don't. And of course, that's not exactly taking responsibility if you're getting help, is it? And childcare can be fucking expensive. Just taking a look at the national average, childcare fees can range anywhere from a third or more of a person's salary per child, a significant amount more if you're not working full-time or have no guaranteed shift pattern, which is a situation faced by a lot of working class people today, as zero-hour contracts and gig work has become increasingly common in recent years. Likewise, even if you do somehow manage to find yourself in a position where this isn't a concern, it's going to be significantly more difficult to compete with your childless peers, both due to perceived unreliability from an employer's perspective, because if you have kids you're often perceived as needing more time off work and less able to drop everything and respond to some work emergency immediately, among many other prejudices, and due to child benefits constantly being cut, many single parents are having to make a wage that ordinarily would struggle to feed one person stretched to feed two or even more. Under these circumstances and against these odds, it's frankly absurd to suggest that single and or teen mothers take responsibility as if that would make a huge amount of difference. In fact, the system is set up in such a way that often many unexpectedly pregnant young women will essentially be forced to terminate a pregnancy to avoid having to deal with these systems that hinder one's ability to effect change by taking responsibility, and in fact one could argue that getting an abortion to terminate a child you know you can't raise is an example of personal responsibility, but often the same people touting this personal responsibility angle are the same as those demonizing and attempting to legislate against abortion rights. Don't have a kid if you can't raise it is bullshit for a number of reasons, but let's be honest here, what this basically means is the poor should not reproduce, right? And considering the demographics of those in poverty due to a series of interconnecting systems of oppression, well, that seems a little eugenicsy to me. Also, you do realise that people can be in a position where they can raise a child only to suffer a misfortune that changes that. As mentioned, everyone is only a couple of incidents of bad luck away from homelessness at any given time, so why are we so hard on people who have kids, are poor, and want a better life for themselves and their children? Why should a society that allows for the existence of billionaires not extend a helping hand to those in need? And crucially, we must ask, why should a 25-year-old parent continue to be punished for a decision they made as a 15-year-old child? Well, because then people might start to ask why, if it's not their own fault, and they may not like the answer.
Do blacks commit more crimes than other races? The simple answer to this question is yes. It's very convenient to self-validate by inventing excuses for one's own poor choices, to project the responsibility for them onto mythical concepts like white supremacy.
I'm going to be making a whole video about this in the not too distant future, so I'll keep this brief for now. The question we must ask when it comes to criminals is this: what is the purpose of prison? If it's a deterrent, then why not bring back the death penalty? If it's a punishment, then why stop there? And why do sentences vary wildly between people and groups depending on crimes committed? Ideally, prisons should be a place for rehabilitation primarily, right? We have this idea that once you've served your time, you should be able to reintegrate back into society, and now you've paid off your debt, you can go back to living as normal. The problem is that this is not the case a majority of the time. Prisons, especially in more conservative places like the US, are brutal places in which people are mistreated and abused, tortured and broken down by a system that is more interested in retribution than justice, and even when they get out, there's no guarantee that they'll be able to reintegrate or become a functional member of society, especially if they've been inside for a significant period of time. They'll likely be traumatized, unable to cope, and in need of some serious therapy, which they likely can't afford because also they have to declare their criminal record to every job they apply for and explain the gap in employment history, and as a result are often discriminated against or refused jobs by people who, rightly or wrongly, believe them to be too high a risk or else underpay and exploit them because they're desperate for work and have no real bargaining power. We've talked before on this channel about the importance of rehabilitative justice over punitive approaches, but it's difficult to really argue that taking responsibility for oneself will do any good when you can't find work and you're mentally fucked due to years of trauma suffered in prison. In fact, I would argue one of the reasons places like the US have such high recidivism rates as opposed to somewhere like Norway, which has a bigger focus on rehabilitation and reintegration, is because if someone is released from prison and tries to make a go of it, accepts that they made mistakes and tries to make up for it by taking personal responsibility, in all likelihood they will struggle or fail, as the systems we labour under discriminate against them and continue to punish them for a mistake or bad choice they made, potentially decades earlier, even after society society claims that they've paid their debt and have served their time. A 45-year-old ex-con can still be being punished by society for a crime he committed at the age of 18, even after being set free, and we need to ask ourselves why we view this as an acceptable state of affairs.
San Quentin, what good do you think you do? Do you think I'll be different when you're through? You bend my heart and mind and you warp my soul. Your stone walls turn my blood a little cold.
So, again, I must ask, why should we keep these systems in place? Why are we so averse to second chances and to helping people turn their lives around? If we really truly care about people taking responsibility, then why not at least give people willing or able to do so a chance to actively affect or improve their lives? Why give up on those who fucked up if they're willing to take responsibility and try again? Personal responsibility has to actually mean something and be able to improve the lives of those who take it, otherwise what's even the point? If all it means is you shouldn't have made any mistakes, fuck you, then what kind of a system is that doesn't allow people to fuck up and learn from their mistake? Well, I guess it's a system that benefits those with a significant enough safety net and or support network to be able to weather any setbacks that come as a result of any poor choices without being stuck in a situation and under a system that no amount of effort or responsibility can help you escape from. Oh right, it's a system that benefits the rich because they can use it to belittle the poor while sucking their own dicks about how self-made they are. What a fucking surprise this isn't.
You're not a victim anymore. You have to take personal responsibility for your lives. You have to take personal accountability for your lives. That's how you're going to get free on this earth. You cannot get free if you do not take personal responsibility. You have to take personal responsibility for your lives.
In this video, I've spent a lot of time identifying problems and pointing out that under our current system it's pointless to blame the individual for a lot of problems faced by society and that it's unfair to do so. But does that mean that there's no such thing as personal responsibility or that individuality simply doesn't exist? Well, of course individuality exists and some of our choices can influence our lives, but the issue is not whether or not it exists, but if that individuality can really be blamed for a lot of society's ills, considering some of the powerful systems that influence and control us and our lives. It's my position that the only way this can be resolved is to, well, fix the system. Quite frankly, until we reach a position where we all have an equal starting point and there are guaranteed safety nets and systems in place to have basic needs met across the board, individual responsibility doesn't have anywhere near as big a role to play as people on the right may like to claim. Maybe, if we reach a situation where no one has to worry about or struggle to have their needs met, we can reach a point where powerful systems no longer have influence over our lives, and then we can discuss the influence of personal responsibility or individual choice or whatever, but that's kind of the problem, right? For all the conservatives bang on about personal responsibility, the systems they support and prop up rob many, if not most of us, the opportunity for personal responsibility to influence our lives at all. In short, personal responsibility only works in a future utopian communist society where insidious systems of control can no longer influence the way our lives are lived, but people who love to idolize it really don't want to believe that, and I doubt they'd be all that willing to join the revolution.
And see what happens. As you paint, you'll see all kind of things happening on your canvas, and very soon you learn to use all these beautiful little things that happen. I think in one of the earlier shows I mentioned, we don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
Hello everyone, it's been a while since my last video, hasn't it? I am back at work now, full time, so I have a lot less time to make videos. I guess you could see the last few months of Sheep in the Box as kind of a trial run for if ever I make enough money to do this full time, because that's probably the output of videos I'd be able to make. Whereas now, obviously, that's going to have to slow way down because I have a lot less free time to write and edit and record and all that stuff. Also, I didn't mention it in the video, but I did want to talk about the problem of soldiers and what position they hold in this personal responsibility ACAB sort of situation. And it's a difficult one because obviously soldiers do prop up horrendous war crimes and imperialism, and they are responsible for a lot of horrendous abuses. However, it is also the case that the military is predominantly made up of working class people who are essentially forced into it, because for many people it's the only place they can get stability, or in some cases, the only place they can afford to go to university. So I guess it's bad on both ends there. The system is bad. It's not necessarily really like the police, because that definitely is a choice. And being in the police doesn't exactly give you free college or anything like that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching this video. I do hope you liked it. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank a huge amount all of my patrons, whose names you currently see on screen right now. If you want to join them, you can donate $1 or more, and your name will appear in the credits of future scripted videos. And if you donate $5 or more, I'll read out your name at the end of the credit. Allow me to demonstrate. So today, I especially want to thank Arne Magnus Narang, Deckard, Aride, The Bulk, Polite Pigeon, The General Line, Good Poon Hates Cops, That Solid Poon Then, Bryden Beck, Elise the Mighty She-Beast, Nanza Kambe, Chris Ragnacci, Theodore Pekelarov, Pixels Green. Next we have Brian, it's Brian, Susie M, Tom Newport, and Bob, along with his trusty sidekick, Les the Mystical Dinosaur. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you again in the next one. Bye!